What's up guys, my name is Ace, and welcome back to the Versus series. This is a series where I take two elements from the game, and I put them up side by side, break down their statistics in great detail, to see which one comes out on top. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the PPSH-41 versus the Proto X1. Now this one's going to be quite interesting, because the PPSH has always been known as sort of the king of SMGs. This is the SMG we saw in competitive play the most out of the entire life cycle of this game. It was never really nerfed, never really changed. And in a lot of people's minds, it was never really challenged by any other SMG. Now, I personally don't fully agree with that. I think there are a lot of other great SMGs out there, and the PPSH is simply very versatile, which is why it was used in the pro scene a lot. But relatively recently, we had a brand new SMG added, and this is the Proto X1, which is actually very surprisingly similar to the PPSH, and quite possibly better. So let's kick it off with some of the basic stats of these guns. As you can see here with our damage profile, they both have identical damage profiles at 30, 29, 23, 19, which means they're both going to be a 4, 5, or 6 shot kill. As for our rate of fire, with the PPSH we have a standard rate of fire of 722 rounds per minute, which bumps up to 769 rounds per minute with rapid fire. And with the Proto X1, we've got a standard rate of fire of 750 rounds per minute with a rapid fire rate of fire of 800 rounds per minute. So clearly here, the Proto X1 does have an advantage. And this advantage obviously translates into time to kill as well. I'm not going to read out all of the numbers because you can see them for yourself, but you can generally see that the Proto X1 is going to be killing just a little bit faster than the PPSH. Keep in mind, in practical terms, assuming you're hitting every single one of your shots and you're not being sloppy with your aim, you're realistically only killing one frame faster with the Proto X1 in most cases, and therefore it's not a super significant difference, but when you start factoring in missed shots, this is where the difference really starts to show up, because the Proto X1 is going to be a bit more forgiving with that time to kill. Now this brings us into our ranges, and this is something I was actually very surprised to see when the Proto X1 launched. These two guns have literally identical range values. They're exactly the same in the range department, exactly the same in the damage profile department. The only difference so far is the rate of fire. This actually carries through with our aim down sight and sprint out time. They're both identical at 160 milliseconds for all of those values. And same thing goes with our movement speeds. Our standard movement speed is 100%, which is normal for SMGs, and our aim down sight strafe speed is also identical for these two at 72%. So far you can see that these are very, very similar guns, and clearly the Proto X1 was based off of the PPSH. Now let's get into one of the key differences and one of the areas where the PPSH actually shines over the Proto X1. This is with magazine capacity. As you can see here, the PPSH has a standard magazine capacity of 35 rounds with 105 in reserve, whereas the Proto X1 only has a 24 round magazine with 72 rounds in reserve. An important thing to note with this as well is since they do have a moderately fast rate of fire, you tend to burn through magazines and ammo fairly quickly, and therefore with the Proto X1, you definitely have to be aware of the total ammo count as well as your magazine count when you're challenging multiple enemies. This isn't nearly as big of an issue with the PPSH. Now obviously that same trend follows suit with extended mags as you can see there, but now let's get into reload time, and as you can see, the Proto X1 does have a faster reload add time, and this is noticeably faster as well. When it comes to reloading, a roughly 200 millisecond difference may seem minimal, but in Call of Duty terms, it is definitely a noticeable amount. That's not to say that the reload time's terrible with the PPSH, it's just a little bit better with the Proto X1. Next up, we'll have a look at hipfire, and as you can see here, once again, they're identical in this area, just like most of the SMGs in the game. And finally, we have one of the most important areas when we're comparing these two guns. This is recoil. As you can see with the PPSH, it's generally pretty vertical recoil, relatively high magnitude, so it will kick up fairly high, but it is quite predictable as well. It sometimes tends to lean a little bit to the right, and it does bounce around side to side just slightly, but primarily it's vertical recoil, and therefore it's quite controllable and predictable. When we get into the Proto X1, we see a somewhat similar story. It is primarily vertical recoil with a relatively high magnitude. But an interesting thing to point out with the Proto X1 is it does tend to have a bit more jump with its recoil. So every once in a while, you get a really big jump between two shots, and this jump is what will often screw you over in a gunfight if you're trying to use the Proto X1. So on average, the PPSH and the Proto X1 are very similar in the recoil department. They'll have a relatively similar feel, but I am going to have to give a slight edge to the PPSH here because the Proto X1 sometimes just has that really unpredictable jump to it. And with that, that's going to cover all of the important stats with these two guns. It's very clear that these guns are very, very similar and in many cases completely identical. The Proto X1 will kill just a little bit faster than the PPSH. It's also a bit more forgiving in the rate of fire department, but that will come at a cost of a lower magazine capacity and total starting ammo, which means extended mags is pretty much a must-have for the Proto X1. And also, I would say that the PPSH is just a little bit easier to control with that recoil. So at the end of the day, which one is better? I think this is one of those times where you can't really definitively say. It has to go based off of your feel. They're both very, very good guns. I would consider both of these to be top tier SMGs. And personally, I tend to lean a little bit more towards the Proto X1, but I can totally understand the argument for having the PPSH instead. And with that, we're going to wrap up today's video. Of course, as always, I'd like to know in the comment section below, which one of these guns do you prefer, the PPSH or the Proto X1? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.